Welcome to Module 1, Lecture 2. In this lecture, we'll be talking to my colleague, Professor Ann Taves from the University of California, Santa Barbara. She'll be talking about the building block approach to religion. So this is an approach where we analyze a religious story, we analyze a religious phenomenon by breaking it down into components. We break it down into its building blocks. The power of this approach is, first of all, you can see how these building blocks combine in a particular way in one phenomenon or story, but then in a completely different way in another story, where different blocks are added, certain blocks are taken away. It gives you a way to compare and contrast religious beliefs and practices from different traditions. It also allows you to sidestep the definitional problem. So we've talked about the fact that nobody agrees on what religion is or how we define religion. You don't have to define religion when you're taking the building block approach. What you're interested in is these individual components. And in some cases, a particular configuration of components will strike us as clearly religious. That's definitely a religious phenomenon. In other cases, it might strike us as superstition or folk practice. It really doesn't matter. So this is a very powerful approach, and it's really come to form the foundation of the cognitive science of religion.
So these concepts of religion, magic, and superstition are kind of unstable, and what they mean actually varies from person to person, even though we seem to think that we know what they mean. And this problem gets even worse if we look across cultures, because in other cultures, they don't necessarily have a concept that translates directly into what we generally think of as religion. So if we're interested in the scientific study of religion and the cognitive science of religion and the kinds of cognitive mechanisms that might be involved with what we're calling religion, we have to figure out how to express the phenomena that we want to explain in more basic kinds of terms. These concepts that are so variable and keep shifting their meaning aren't stable enough. Rather than starting with these concepts that are usually expressed as nouns, like religion or philosophy or superstition, we have to express what it is that we want to study in terms of things that people are doing or things that are happening, in terms of an event or a behavior, something that an individual or a group is doing. Then we're starting to express the phenomena that we want to understand in terms that science can actually explain how something like that might happen or explain that behavior. Let's take the concept of resurrection. It's a concept that we find in related forms in a variety of traditions. But let's just take it in Christianity, because that's a tradition where it's a very important concept and one that's been thought about for 2 millennia now of theological reflection. We can see it in a very basic form in the Apostles' Creed, which states Jesus rose from the dead. But if we go back to look at evidence that we have in the New Testament for why his followers believed that he rose from the dead, what we find are accounts of Jesus appearing to his followers after his death. There are any number of ways that we could come at that. So let's take the story of the road to Emmaus. This is a story of 2 of Jesus' disciples walking down a road to the town of Emmaus. They had just started on this journey after hearing from Mary and the other women at Jesus' tomb that they'd seen 2 dazzling men who reported to them that Jesus was still alive. The disciples then are referred to as thinking of this as a vision of angels. So the disciples are thinking about what they've just heard from the women as they're walking on the road to Emmaus. Jesus died not that long before. They're deeply disturbed because they didn't expect that a Messiah would be crucified and die on a cross. So they're puzzling over this, having just heard this story from the women, when a stranger joins in their conversation and explains to them that if they would read the Hebrew scriptures, their own scripture, they would realize that there were prophecies there that explained that Jesus would have to suffer and die. They are so impressed by the stranger that they convince the stranger to join them for a meal in Emmaus. And as they are breaking bread, they all of a sudden realize who the stranger was. And in the breaking of the bread, the story goes, they realize that it's Jesus. And then he's gone. So now the question is, what do we do with this? If we want to think about this from a more naturalistic, psychological kind of perspective, is there any way that we could explain how something like this might happen? Let's just pretend that this box here represents all the beliefs and practices that coalesce to form early Christianity. And so inside the box, we have various things. We have the preaching of the gospel. We have the practice of baptism. And we have the claim that Jesus appeared to his followers after his death. We can take this claim and we can take it apart and see the different components that led them to claim that Jesus was really present and appeared to them on the road to Emmaus. At this first level here, we have the grief of his followers, representing the grief of the women at the tomb and the grief of the disciples. Then this block, this represents the experience of the women at the tomb who had the vision of the angels who told them that Jesus was still alive. From the disciples' point of view, this block represents a prime in psychological terms. It primed them to think that Jesus might still be alive. Then we have this block, which represents the cognitive dissonance felt by the disciples that they're pondering as they walk on the road to Emmaus. So this block then represents the appearance of the stranger who comes with an explanation that will resolve the cognitive dissonance that they're experiencing at precisely the moment that they are struggling with it. And the fact that he appears right in the midst of their struggle is something that we could describe in psychological terms as a synchronous event. The two things happen right at the same time. But they still haven't recognized the stranger. It's not until they're in Emmaus sharing a meal together and they break the bread that they recognize who this stranger is. So in psychological terms, we can hypothesize the breaking of the bread served as a memory cue. It reminded them of the last time they'd seen Jesus at the Last Supper when he broke bread. And it's that memory that cues them as to who this person is. So this then ties together the whole event. So not only do they experience the presence of a stranger who resolves their problem, but they realize who this stranger is. They recognize him. And the minute they recognize him, he's gone. A useful aspect of the building block approach is that we can take apart all the components we've assembled and look at another event and see that some of these same building blocks are involved in that other event. So, for example, let's take a story told by a colleague, Justin Barrett, who uses the example of a castle people claim is haunted, and a person who doesn't really believe in ghosts goes, but as he walks through the castle, just at the point where he's announcing that he doesn't believe in ghosts, this sword falls off the wall and narrowly misses his arm. And as you might expect, the first thing that pops into this guy's mind is, oh my God, it's a ghost. Well, let's assume that he's not in the throes of grief, so let's not use the grief blocks. So here's our priming block, the idea that this castle is haunted. So just as he's saying that he doesn't believe in ghosts, a surprising event happens. The sword falls. This inserts a moment of uncertainty and perhaps cognitive dissonance. The fact that the sword falls so close to his arm and does so right after he said that he doesn't believe in ghosts is another of these synchronous timing events that we as human beings have a tendency to think must have some kind of meaning. So here's our synchronous event block. But there's more than that. Remember, the sword is falling really close to his arm right after he said this. That creates a feeling of fear. We need a new block to represent the fear that he feels. This is not grief. Now we've got fear. And these blocks combined lead him to infer the presence of a ghost. Having now created models of two different kinds of events, I think what it tells us is that these different components can be mixed and matched in different kinds of ways in events that have some similarities and some differences. Notice that we use some of the same building blocks and some different ones. We had emotion in both, but the emotions were different. We had priming in both, but the content of what was primed was different. We're now working with a psychological language that can describe the building blocks, even though they come together to form phenomena that we think of as very different. So for the purpose of scholarship, it allows us to see things that seem so different on the surface as a major world religion like Christianity and an experience of a ghost in a haunted house may have some components that are similar at a cognitive level in terms of how particular events that are involved in the emergence of these different phenomena come together. When we take a building block approach, we don't have to be so worried about, are we talking about religion or are we talking about haunted houses? We as scholars, as researchers, don't have to define religion. We can start with these events or these behaviors, and we can look at how people who are related to the events define them. We can look at those who interpret an event as a religious event and those who dispute that. So we can look at how people form into groups that interpret these events in very different ways.
So Professor Tave's building block approach has really caught on in the cognitive science of religion because of its power, this conceptual idea of breaking things down into pieces. So breaking down religious beliefs or practices into components. And once you do that, you can analyze these components individually, you can see how they fit together with other components, and you can perceive deeper similarities between things that on the surface may seem quite different. So that was lecture 2. In the next lecture, lecture 3, we're going to turn to what makes the cognitive science of religion distinctive as a methodological approach. What makes it different from other approaches to religion? And we're going to see how the building block approach that we've just looked at hooks up with the cognitive science of religion approach. The idea of breaking down religion into its different features, talking about where these components come from evolutionarily, so how did they evolve, and also talking about how they function in the human mind. So what are the cognitive mechanisms that cause people to entertain religious beliefs and engage in religious practices.